Hello, my name's Steve. Welcome to American Steam Legacy, a channel dedicated to American railroad history. This video is part one of a six-part series dedicated to the Whyte notation. We'll be taking a brief look at the 4 and 6 coupled locomotives of the Whyte notation and some of the more noteworthy locomotives of each type. This is by no means an exhaustive collection of 4 and 6 coupled locomotives, so if there is a wheel configuration you would like covered in a future video, please leave a comment down below. So, coming up next are the more noteworthy 4 and 6 coupled locomotives of the Whyte notation on American Steam Legacy. The 040 wheel configuration isn't widely known by a particular name, like the 464 is known as the Hudson, or the 284 being known as the Berkshire. The 040 wheel configuration is mostly associated with the early steam locomotives of the 1830s, or locomotives designed for light industrial switching service, so the type is commonly referred to as a switcher. And while it's true that the 040 was mostly used in this capacity and wasn't considered mainline power for most of the steam era, there was a time when this wheel configuration was exactly that, mainline power. It's been said that all great things have humble beginnings, and American railroad motive power is certainly no exception. Hardly anyone in the 1830s could have imagined what American steam power was going to evolve into over the coming decades. The humble contraptions that graced the rails of early American railroads, spooking horses and starting brush fires, set American railroads and American locomotive manufacturers on a course that would culminate with the superpower steam giants of the 1940s and 1950s. The Best Friend of Charleston wasn't the first steam locomotive to operate in the United States, but it was the first to be built in the U.S. Since its charter in 1827, the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company had planned on using horses not just on its canal, but also on its railroad. Horatio Allen, formerly of the Delaware and Hudson and a civil engineer by training, joined the South Carolina Railroad as chief engineer, and based on his experience with steam power, he managed to convince the railroad's directors to employ steam locomotives. Given the length of the rail line the South Carolina had envisioned, steam power seemed to be the most economical option. Designed by E.L. Miller, the railroad's engineer, construction of Best Friend of Charleston began in January of 1830 at the West Point Foundry in New York City, and delivered in October of the same year. The locomotive weighed 4.5 tons, featured a vertical fire tube boiler operating at 50 psi, and 4 drive wheels 54 inches in diameter. Producing 12 horsepower, it could reach a speed of 20 miles per hour, which was twice the anticipated speed. On January 15, 1831, Best Friend of Charleston became the first locomotive to pull a regularly scheduled passenger train. This made the South Carolina Railroad the first common carrier railroad in the United States to successfully adopt steam power. In June of 1831, the locomotive was destroyed by a boiler explosion. The locomotive's fireman had tied down a pressure safety valve to prevent the locomotive from hissing, since a hissing sound was considered rude even if it was issued from a machine instead of a person. The fireman, as well as several others, were killed in the explosion. Later, the locomotive would be rebuilt and renamed Phoenix. 2 replicas of Best Friend of Charleston survive. One is on display at the Best Friend Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, and the second is displayed at the South Carolina Museum in Columbia, South Carolina. The 440 wheel configuration is known as the American type, and for good reason. This 4-coupled locomotive, featuring a 4-wheeled pilot truck, was first developed and patented in the United States in 1836. The American type would become the mainstay of American railroad motive power and proved so versatile that more than 21,000 would be built by the year 1900. One of the things associated with the American, probably more so than any other locomotive type, are the embellishments the type would receive in the mid-19th century. Elaborate, multicolored paint schemes complete with pinstriping, plenty of polished metal, ornate metal work on the steam and sand domes and headlight brackets, a large kerosene headlight that was overshadowed by an even larger bonnet-type smokestack. However, not all American types were rolling works of art, and the first locomotive with a 440 wheel configuration wasn't even successful. Designed by Henry Campbell, an engineer with the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railroad, The Campbell 440, as it was initially called, incorporated the lessons learned from earlier designs. The four-wheel pilot truck allowed the locomotive to negotiate sharp curves, and a set of coupled drive wheels provided superior traction with an axle load of 8,000 pounds. With a boiler pressure of 90 psi, which was quite high for the time, and cylinders 14 inches in diameter, the locomotive produced 4,373 pounds of tractive effort. The major drawback of the Campbell design is that it was unable to cope with the crude track over which it had to operate. Since early track was poorly and cheaply constructed, the humps and hollows in the trackwork prevented the locomotive from keeping its wheels firmly planted on the rails due to the axles being attached directly to the locomotive's rigid frame. It was the lack of suspension that deemed the Campbell 440 unsuccessful, perhaps unfairly, since the problem was more with the track than the locomotive itself. Campbell would later rectify the problem, but another 440 type designed by John Harrison and built in 1837 would incorporate a three-point suspension system. The Hercules, as it was named, proved to be successful, and many other similar locomotives were produced in the 1830s. The 442 Atlantic was one of the locomotive types responsible for the American type and the 10-wheeler falling out of favor. The Atlantic takes its name from the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, which operated a fleet of 442s built by Baldwin in 1894. The 442 wheel arrangement has also been referred to as the Milwaukee, although this name didn't catch on quite like the Atlantic moniker. The Atlantic combined the best features of the American and the 242 Columbia. The Atlantic retained the tall drive wheels of the American, while adding a trailing truck that allowed for a larger firebox and, by extension, a larger boiler. The greater steaming capacity allowed the Atlantics to run at higher speed, making them ideal for passenger service. For about 10 years, the Atlantic was the most popular passenger locomotive, but the transition away from wooden passenger cars to those made of steel led to the Atlantic giving way to the more powerful Pacifics. After 1910, Atlantics were still produced, but in much lower numbers. In the 1930s, the Milwaukee Road gave the Atlantic a new lease on life, at least for a while. The railroad ordered 4 high-speed, streamlined Atlantics to head the road's crack passenger train, the Hiawatha. Even though the streamlined Atlantics would reach speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour, they too gave way to streamlined 462 Pacifics later in the decade. Even as the 462 Pacific became the predominant passenger locomotive, the Pennsylvania Railroad continued to develop the Atlantic. The road's E-Class Atlantics culminated with the E6S class in 1914. The S designation indicating the locomotive was equipped with a superheater. Weighing in at over 243,000 pounds, the E6S were the heaviest Atlantics built. The addition of a superheater had remarkable results on the locomotive's performance. Coal and water consumption was sharply reduced, and the Pennsylvania railroads that these Atlantics reached speeds of 127 miles per hour. But even these super Atlantics couldn't hold off the rise of the Pacific type and would eventually give way to the Pennsylvania Railroad's K-Class Pacifics. Like the 040 wheel configuration, the 060 is best known for use in yard switching and transfer service. While it was effective in these roles, it would begin to fall out of favor as freight and passenger cars became heavier in the first decades of the 20th century. However, with the U.S. entry into World War I and the nationalization of the nation's railroads, the United States Railroad Administration provided a reprieve for the 060 switcher. In 1916, 402 six-coupled switchers were ordered by the nation's railroad, so the 060 wheel configuration hadn't quite reached obsolescence, at least not yet. The United States Railroad Administration, or USRA, not only ran the nation's railroads, but also controlled what types of locomotives could be manufactured during the U.S. involvement in the war. Given the demand the war effort was placing on the nation's industrial sector, the USRA wanted to realize economies of scale by limiting the number of locomotive types the American locomotive manufacturers could produce. Since long production runs of identical products is more efficient than short production runs of varied products, the USRA developed standardized designs for 6 locomotive types, with a heavy and a light version of each type for a total of 12. The USRA's 6-coupled switcher design was based on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad's M2 class, which proved itself a capable locomotive in both yard switching and transfer service. The M2 could handle up to 3,000 tons on grades of just under 1%. Even though the USRA 060 switchers were based on a successful design, and 255 would be produced, the USRA received a litany of complaints from many of the railroads that purchased them. Complaints such as the tender's coal pusher is superfluous, The cab is made out of steel instead of wood, the length and location of the throttle handle is wrong, and the location of the pilot beam footboards drew the ire of at least one railroad. These complaints were mostly due to the railroad's preference for locomotives built to their own specifications, and the USRA was very much aware of this. As these nitpicky complaints came in, the USRA would pencil whip them with an argument to the contrary or by referring to applicable federal safety standards. There was, however, two complaints the USRA not only took seriously, but actually took action to remedy. The tenders supplied with both the 6 and 8 coupled switchers were the same tenders used on USRA road engines, such as the Light Pacific. Switchers typically use a slope-back tender, or a tender where the top of the coal space is narrower than the water tank, for better visibility when running in reverse. The large tenders that came with the USRA switchers were very unpopular for this reason, and the fact the engineer had to hang out of the cab window in order to get a better view when running in reverse. The USRA tried to correct this by modifying existing tenders or supplying new ones. The other complaint pertaining to the throttle handle was also addressed. The USRA allowed design changes that included a longer throttle lever, retaining bolts added to the balancing ring, and regulating the lift of the balancing valves. In the years following the end of World War I, only 8 railroads ordered copies of the USRA 6-coupled switcher. This wasn't necessarily an indictment of the USRA design, but more of an indication of the 6-coupled switcher having outlived its usefulness. 6-coupled locomotives with a pivoting two-wheel pilot truck began to appear around 1860. By 1870, the type had become known as the Mogul. Some sources believe the term Mogul is a reference to Indian Mogul emperors, since the 260 was, for the time, a large and powerful locomotive when first introduced. Others believe the name may stem from a 260 locomotive named Mogul, built in 1866 by the Taunton Works for the Central Railroad of New Jersey. Whatever the case, by 1870, the term was generally accepted to mean a 260 wheel configuration. The 260 was intended for heavy freight service, where the 440 American type lacked the power or adhesion to climb steep grades. The Erie Railroad and the Louisville and Nashville were among the early proponents of the 260, since both roads would operate unusually heavy trains on steep grades. The Mogul would also see service heading passenger trains in mountainous territory as well as light suburban passenger service. Approximately 11,000 Moguls were produced between 1860 and 1910. However, the Mogul's rise as a freight locomotive was cut short by the growing popularity of the 280 consolidations on standard gauge railroads. The Mogul had somewhat better luck on the narrow gauge railroads operating in the U.S. as well as on logging railroads. Many 260 locomotives, both standard and narrow gauge, survive on static display or have been restored back to operational status. One such Mogul operates on the Walt Disney World Railroad located in the Magic Kingdom theme park in Bay Lake, Florida. Built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1928, the locomotive was operated by a 3-foot gauge railroad in Mexico. In 1968, the locomotive was purchased for approximately $8,000 and shipped back to the United States for use on the Walt Disney World Railroad, then under construction. After an extensive restoration, the locomotive was placed in service in October 1971 and named Lily Bell, after Lillian Disney, Walt Disney's wife. The 262 wheel arrangement had been in use on railroads around the world as early as the 1880s, but didn't appear on American railroads until the turn of the 20th century. The 262 evolved out of the 260 Mogul, the same way the 442 Atlantic evolved from the 440 American type. The first American railroad to roster the 262 was the McCloud River Railroad, a logging railroad, in 1898. The Baldwin-built locomotive proved ideal due to its compact size and light axle loading, since the railroad had lightly built track and rather sharp curves, which was typical of logging railroads. The road would go on the roster at least 12 262s between 1898 and 1925. In 1900, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy pioneered the use of 262 in freight service. Since the CB&Q operated their 262s over the Granger lines that ran through the prairies of the upper Midwest, the 262 became known as the Prairie type. The road would eventually acquire 400 prairies, accounting for nearly half of the approximately 1,000 built for U.S. railroads. The Prairie was very much a niche locomotive, which explains the small number produced. Due to its light axle loading, it wasn't quite suited for heavy freight service. When running at higher speeds, the Prairie had a tendency to nose considerably, since the two-wheel pilot truck provided insufficient front-end stability. Given the 262's limited ability, it's somewhat surprising that some remained in service until the end of the steam era. Most of the railroads that operated the type quickly replaced them with 280 consolidations and 282 Mikados. The 460 wheel configuration was the natural progression from the 440 American type. Early examples were merely elongated versions of the American to accommodate a third set of drive wheels. The 460 type was referred to as a 10-wheeler right from the start, and the wheel arrangement was never given a more colorful moniker. There is some debate over who exactly built the first 10-wheeler, but the Norris brothers produced one of the first for the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad in 1847. Initially, the 10-wheeler was used in heavy freight service. By the 1860s, it would be used in passenger service as well, and by the 1870s, the 10-wheeler began to challenge the American type in overall popularity. Approximately 17,000 10-wheelers were produced, including a variant known as a camelback used in commuter service. However, the 10-wheeler's rise to popularity was cut short by the appearance of the 442 Atlantics taking over passenger service and the rise of the 280 consolidation in heavy freight. Perhaps the most famous 10-wheeler is the Illinois Central No. 382. The locomotive Casey Jones was operating on that fateful night in 1900. Built by the Rogers Locomotive Works at Paterson, New Jersey in 1898, No. 382 was typical for its time. She came equipped with a Stephenson-type valve gear, slide valves rather than piston valves, and a narrow boiler backed by a narrow firebox set between the last set of drive wheels. After the wreck that killed Casey Jones, No. 382 would be rebuilt and provide many years of additional service, but the locomotive would be involved in a string of accidents that killed 6 and injured several others. No. 382 would be modernized with Baker valve gear, replacing the Stephenson type, and the steam chests would be modified to accept piston valves, but No. 382 would be retired from service and ultimately scrapped in 1935. As passenger cars continued to become larger and heavier, the 442 Atlantic began to show its shortcomings. This, coupled with the need to pull longer trains, revealed the need for a more powerful locomotive for passenger service. The 4-coupled locomotives didn't provide the necessary tractive effort, and the 10-wheeler with its small firebox didn't have the steaming capacity for the high speeds required. The 462 Pacific was the ideal solution. The Pacific featured a large firebox and boiler to provide the necessary steaming capacity, 6 drive wheels provided better adhesion, and a 4-wheel pilot truck for better stability at high speeds. The first American railroad to use the type was the Missouri and Pacific in 1903, hence the 462 becoming known as the Pacific. One of the most well-known Pacific types was the Pennsylvania Railroad's K4 class. The Pennsylvania Railroad acquired 425 K4s between 1914 and 1928, 350 built by the Pennsylvania Railroad's Juniata shops, and 75 more built by Baldwin. As with most Pennsylvania Railroad locomotives, the K4 Pacifics featured the prominent Bell-Pair firebox. Most of the K4s lacked mechanical stokers and were hand-fired, much to the chagrin of many a fireman. In 1936, the Pennsylvania Railroad joined the trend of streamlining, and the K4 number 3768 received some extra sheet metal. The Pennsylvania Railroad recruited Raymond Loewy, who was already known for his work on the GG1 electrics, to design the streamlined casings. The resulting appearance of the locomotive prompted its engineers to call it the Torpedo. 3768 was, for the most part, mechanically identical to the long-running production version. However, it was 15 tons heavier and equipped with a 6-axle tender. The streamlined K4 would often head the Pennsylvania Railroad's famous Broadway limited passenger train. Eventually, number 3768, as well as 3 other locomotives that received the same treatment, would lose their streamlined cladding. The 464 wheel arrangement was intended to handle heavy passenger trains at speeds of 60 miles per hour, more or less, but some 464s were used as dual-purpose locomotives handling freight as well. The 464 became known as the Hudson, borrowing its name from the Hudson River, along which the New York Central operated a portion of its water-level route at the suggestion of Pat Crowley, then president of the New York Central. While the New York Central was the first American railroad to operate the type, it wasn't the only railroad to conceive a 464 wheel configuration. The Milwaukee Road developed a 464 independently and about at the same time as the New York Central. However, the New York Central received their first 464 in 1927, while the Milwaukee Road couldn't afford to build theirs until 1929 and called them Baltics rather than adopting the New York Central lexicon. The New York Central's passenger business had grown to the extent that passenger trains had to be run in sections due to the road's Pacifics being able to only handle 12 cars. The New York Central's chief mechanical engineer of motive power and rolling stock, Paul W. Kiefer, decided to go ahead with an experimental 464 and selected the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO, to build it. The first New York Central Hudson arrived on the property on February 14, 1927, and was given the road number 5200 and a class designation of J1A. The Hudson quickly proved itself as a heavy passenger hauler. The J1A could move an 18-car passenger train weighing 1,200 tons at a speed of 55 miles per hour. The New York Central fleet of Hudsons would eventually reach 275 units, which accounted for more than half of all Hudsons built for American railroads and would dominate the New York Central's express trains for the next 20 years. The introduction of the Milwaukee Road's Burlington Zephyr and the Union Pacific's M10,000 in the mid-1930s kindled American railroads' interest in streamlining steam locomotives. This was the Art Deco period, after all, and since the streamlining concept was being applied to just about everything else, well, why not trains? Early attempts at streamlining locomotives resulted in something resembling an upside-down bathtub on wheels, such is the case with the streamlined shrouds designed by Norman Zaff for the New York Central Hudson number 5344 in 1934. Number 5344 was named the Commodore Vanderbilt after the railroad's founder and is considered to be the first streamlined American steam locomotive. Beginning in 1937, the New York Central rostered what is considered one of the most well-executed examples of locomotive streamlining. 10 Hudsons of the J3A class, road numbers 5445 to 5454, received streamlined cladding designed by famed designer Henry Dreyfuss. Dreyfuss's design sought to conform to the shape and proportions of the locomotive rather than cover them up completely. The running gear was left exposed while the cladding improved the locomotive's aerodynamics when running at speeds. The Dreyfuss Hudsons, as they would become known, were particularly stunning when pulling passenger cars dressed up in the same livery. The Dreyfuss Hudsons would often be seen heading up the New York Central's 20th Century Limited passenger train on runs between New York and Chicago. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And once again, my name's Steve, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.